10 Days That Shook the World is a book by American journalist and socialist John Reid about the October Revolution in Russia in 1917, which Reid experienced firsthand. Reid followed many of the prominent Bolshevik leaders closely during his time in Russia. John Reid died in 1920, shortly after the book was finished, and he is one of the few Americans buried at the Kremlin Wall Necropolis in Moscow, a site normally reserved only for the most prominent Soviet leaders. Concept and creation. John Reid was on an assignment for the Masses, a magazine of socialist politics, when he was reporting the Russian Revolution. Although Reid states that he had tried to see events with the eye of a conscientious reporter, interested in setting down the truth during the time of the event, he stated in the preface that, in the struggle my sympathies were not neutral. Before John Reid left for Russia, the Espionage Act was passed on June 15, 1917, which fined and imprisoned anyone who interfered with the recruiting of soldiers and prohibited the mailing of any newspaper or magazine that promoted such sentiments. The U.S. Postal Service was also given leave to deny any mailing that fitted these standards from further postal delivery, and then to disqualify a magazine because it had missed a mailing and hence was no longer considered a regular publication. Because of this, the Masses was forced by the United States federal government to cease publication in the fall of 1917, after refusing to change the magazine's policy against the war. The Liberator, founded by Max Eastman under his and his sister's private control, published Reid's articles concerning the Russian Revolution instead. In an effort to ensure the magazine's survival, Eastman compromised and tempered its views accordingly. Upon returning from Russia during April 1918 from Christiania in Norway, after being barred from either traveling to the United States or returning to Russia since February 23 by the State Department, Reid's trunk of notes and materials on the revolution, which included Russian handbills, newspapers, and speeches, were seized by custom officials, who interrogated him for 4 hours over his activities in Russia during the previous 8 months. Michael Gold, an eyewitness to Reid's arrival to Manhattan, recalls how a swarm of Department of Justice men stripped him, went over every inch of his clothes and baggage, and put him through the usual inquisition. Reid had been sick with ptomaine on the boat. The Inquisition had also been painful. Back home during midsummer 1918, Reid, worried that his vivid impressions on the revolution would fade, fought hard to regain his papers from the possession of the government, who refused to return them. Reid would not receive his materials until 7 months later in November. Max Eastman recalls a meeting with John Reid in the middle of Sheridan Square during the period of time when Reid isolated himself writing the book. He wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, wrote it in another 10 days and 10 nights, a little more. He was gaunt, unshaven, greasy-skinned, a stark, sleepless, half-crazy look on his slightly potato-like face had come down after a night's work for a cup of coffee. Max, don't tell anybody where I am. I'm writing the Russian Revolution in a book. I've got all the placards and papers up there in a little room and a Russian dictionary, and I'm working all day and all night. I haven't shut my eyes for 36 hours. I'll finish the whole thing in 2 weeks. And I've got a name for it too. 10 Days That Shook the World. Goodbye. I've got to go get some coffee. Don't for God's sake tell anybody where I am. Do you wonder? I emphasize his brains. Not so many feats can be found in American literature to surpass what he did there in those 2 or 3 weeks in that little room with those piled up papers in a half-known tongue, piled clear up to the ceiling, and a small dog-eared dictionary, and a memory, and a determination to get it right, and a gorgeous imagination to paint it when he got it. But what I wanted to comment on now now was the unqualified, concentrated joy in his mad eyes that morning. He was doing what he was made to do, writing a great book. And he had a name for it too. 10 Days That Shook the World. Critical response. 10 Days That Shook the World has received mixed response since its publication in 1919, resulting in a wide range of critical reviews from negative to positive. However, the book was overall positively received by critics at the time of its first publication, despite some critics' vocal opposition to Reed's political beliefs. George F. Kennan, an American diplomat and historian who had no love for Bolshevism and is best known as the father of containment, praised the book. Reed's account of the events of that time rises above every other contemporary record for its literary power, its penetration, its command of detail, and would be remembered when all others are forgotten. Kennan saw it as the reflection of blazing honesty and a purity of idealism that did unintended credit to the American society that produced him, the merits of which he himself understood so poorly. Quote, on March 1, 1999, the New York Times reported New York University's top 100 works of journalism list, which placed 10 Days That Shook the World in 7th position. Project director Mitchell Stevens explains the reasoning behind the judge's decision. Perhaps the most controversial work on our list is the 7th John Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World, reporting on the October Revolution in Russia in 1917. Yes, as conservative critics have noted, Reed was a partisan. Yes, historians would do better. But this was probably the most consequential news story of the century, and Reed was there, and Reed could write. The magnitude of the event being reported on and the quality of the writing were other important standards in our considerations. But not all responses were positive. Joseph Stalin argued in 1924 that Reed was misleading in regards to Leon Trotsky. The book portrays Trotsky as a man who co-led the revolution with Lenin and mentions Stalin only twice, one of them being only in the recitation of a list of names, as both Lenin and Trotsky were internationally known, whereas the activities of other Bolshevik militants were virtually unknown. Russian writer Anatoly Rybakov elaborates on Stalinist Soviet Union's ban on 10 Days That Shook the World. The main task was to build a mighty socialist state. For that, mighty power was needed. Stalin was at the head of the power, which meant that he stood at its source with Lenin. Together with Lenin, he led the October Revolution. John Reed had presented the history of October differently. That wasn't the John Reed we needed. Quote, after Stalin's death, the book was allowed to recirculate. In 2000, the Conservative Intercollegiate Studies Institute listed 10 Days That Shook the World among its 50 worst books of the 20th century. Publication. After its first publication, Reed returned to Russia in the fall of 1919, delighted to learn that Vladimir Lenin had taken time to read the book. Furthermore, Lenin agreed to write an introduction that first appeared in the 1922 edition published by Boney and Amp Liverite. With the greatest interest and with never slackening attention I read John Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World. Unreservedly do I recommend it to the workers of the world. Here is a book which I should like to see published in millions of copies and translated into all languages. It gives a truthful and most vivid exposition of the events significant to the comprehension of what really is the proletarian revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat. These problems are widely discussed, but before one can accept or reject these ideas, he must understand the full significance of his decision. John Reed's book will undoubtedly help to clear this question, which is the fundamental problem of the international labor movement. v. Lenin. End of 1919. In his introduction to Animal Farm titled Freedom of the Press, George Orwell claims that the British Communist Party published a version omitting Lenin's introduction and mention of Trotsky. At the death of John Reed, the author of 10 Days That Shook the World, a first-hand account of the early days of the Russian Revolution, the copyright of the book passed into the hands of the British Communist Party, to whom I believe Reid had bequeathed it. Some years later, the British Communists, having destroyed the original edition of the book as completely as they could, issued a garbled version from which they had eliminated mentions of Trotsky and also omitted the introduction written by Lenin. Film adaptations. In 1928, Sergei Eisenstein filmed the book as October, 10 Days That Shook the World. In 1967, Granada Television presented a feature-length version of the events narrated and essentially a new work with the same title by Orson Welles. John Reed's own exploits and parts of the book itself were the basis of the 1981 Warren Beatty film Reds. In 1982, the Soviet filmmaker Sergei Bondarchuk used the book as the basis of his film Red Bells.